I invite you to open up your Bibles to the book of Ephesians, chapter 5, and we'll begin there in just a moment. Before we get started there, let me just note that the books for the ladies and the men's classes that we'll be using on prayer are in on the lower shelf on the table out here where the children's fill-in sheets in the evening usually are. And so if you wanted a physical copy, those are there, and I invite you to pick one of those up. If you want a digital copy, I'll have that PDF being sent out this week. And so if we need to get some more, we can order some more, but hopefully we've got everybody covered who wants one of those. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 16 is, I think, a familiar passage to most of us. There, Paul, and we'll talk a little bit more about the context a little bit later, but in the midst of several sort of practical instructions, he says this: redeeming the time because the days are evil. We're going to talk about redeeming the time this morning as we go along in our lesson. Several months ago, Brad Collins was talking about a book called Albion's Seed, and he kept talking about it. And he said, it's just really fascinating. And I said, well, I'll have to pick that up. And then I looked at it, and I thought, maybe not. But then Larson Plyler started talking about it and said I needed to read it. And then another guy said it. And so at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, I finally picked it up to read it. It's a pretty fascinating book. And what the guy does is he goes through basically 4 groups of cultures that immigrated to the United States in the 1600s, before it was the United States. And he talks about how the way that they live life goes all the way back to England, and the way that we live life today is still really an echo and a reflection of the ways they were living life 400 years ago. And it's really fascinating to see some of those connections, but a couple of things he talked about really got me thinking as far as how we live our lives and how we think about our lives. And one of those was about the ways that people spent their time. And so that's what we're going to be talking about is what he calls time ways of these various groups. It is so much a reflection of what they believed spiritually, what they believed about life, and it comes out in the way that they dealt with time. And one of the things is that they sort of had phrases that they would use, and we'll look at each one of those phrases in turn. There were 4 groups of people that he talked about: the Puritans up in New England, the Cavalier culture in Virginia, the Quaker culture in what he calls the Midlands in Maryland and Pennsylvania, and then the backcountry or backwater people that would be down in the South. And so these different people talked and behaved obviously in different ways and kind of still do today. But maybe some of that has mixed together and some of that has changed. And we'll talk about some of that as we go through the lesson this morning. The first group that I want to talk about is the Puritans. And they talked about time like this: we want to improve the time. Now that sounds pretty good, and really it was pretty good. It involved kind of getting the most out of the day. The invention of the alarm clock, which you may be pleased at or angry at. You can blame the Puritans for that. They decided, I want to be able to get up at the same time every day and start my day off efficiently and get lots of things done. They built their houses when they couldn't afford clocks. They built their houses so that as the sun shone in through the windows, it was basically an architectural sundial. You could look in the house and see what time it was by where the sun was shining in through the house because they faced them all in that direction and so forth. So they really were concentrated and focused on that. They were sort of like the original productivity gurus and had lots of advice along those lines. This connects to making money. Benjamin Franklin, who lived in Quaker territory, was born among Puritans in Boston. And of course, he coined the phrase, time is money. And so, when you're wasting time, you're wasting money. And so it had to do with productivity and so forth. Now, it had a spiritual element. We want to be productive because we are stewards of God's time, and that's right, and that's valuable and good. But I think there's some dangers there as well. First of all, let me just suggest this, that the Bible certainly does praise productivity with our time. And we want to be careful and thoughtful about not being lazy and not being wasteful with the time that God has given us. I think about Proverbs 31. One of the things I think when we read through that, we have lots of spiritual qualities, but one of the ones that jumps out is just productiveness. Here is a woman who is just constantly busy. I was making a tour at some point through, I think it may have been Williamsburg, Virginia, and they were talking about sort of the life of a servant and how constant the activity was for the life of a servant. Up at when the sun comes up or even before the sun comes up and working all the way till the sun goes down. That really was most of society for a long time. Most people in all the world worked from the time the sun came up to the sun came down. The idea of the amount of leisure time that we have, that's a very modern sort of a concept. Most people you couldn't live, you couldn't survive. Now there were people obviously in wealthy positions maybe that could put some of that work off onto somebody else. But most people have lived in that category of having to be productive most of the day. Here were people in New England, though, who were fairly prosperous, but still thought we still need to be productive. We don't need to just be lazy, even though we have more maybe time that is not required of us. Even in using the illustration of Matthew 25, I understand that Jesus is making a spiritual application, but he's using, I think, a true principle with the story of the talents. Here you have the master who gives these talents to these men, and you have, of course, the two productive servants, and then you have the wasteful servant there with the talents. And while I don't think it's make sure you use your money well, that's not the point, I certainly think it's not a throwaway point. That God does care how we use what he has given us, including our time and money. So productivity is a good thing. I think a recognition of the limited nature of time, to think of time as a resource. We don't do that, I think, nearly enough. It's probably the most limited resource. Most resources can be increased in some way, right? You can produce more in some way. Maybe we can go mine for more in some way. You can't change one bit of how much time is available. It just simply is. And so every moment of time that you waste is nothing you can get back. There's no way to get that back. Romans chapter 13, again, in a spiritual sense, speaks to time from the standpoint of urgency. Romans chapter 13 and verse 11, where Paul writes, "Do this, knowing the time, that it is already the hour for you to awaken from sleep. For now salvation is nearer to us than when we believed." I think that's one of the things, one of the key elements when I'm talking to people about time who I think may be wasteful with their time, is just understanding how little of it you have and how urgent it is to do something with that. And there will come a time, there does come a time for everyone in their lives where they look back and at some point they realize, oh, I wish I had more now. It's too late. That time's gone. And so having a constant sense of that is certainly a valuable thing. And the Puritans highlighted that. I think, though, one of the dangers is losing sight of true priorities. There can be a shift that occurs from being productive because I want to be a useful vessel and a useful servant for God, that shifts over to I want to be great. I want to accomplish great things for my own name's sake. I want to make a lot of money for maybe obvious reasons. And so it shifts from I want to do this for the Lord to I just want to do this for more personal, ego-driven reasons. Over in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28, as Paul is talking about there, really how we make usage of our lives, how we make usage of our time. He says in Ephesians 4 and verse 28 that we ought to, that's Galatians, Ephesians 4 verse 28. He says that he who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with the one who has need. There's a spiritual focus. Go get to work. Get to work so you can make money. Get to work so you can make money so that you'll have enough to share. That's usually not where this ends up. This ends up in a place of, I want to make more money so that I can either live a life of comfort, so that I can have power and prestige, all those sorts of things. We live in a culture, I think, of hyper-productivity. And we'll talk about, there's an opposite extreme there. But people just want to make sure, they want to be considered the greatest and the grandest of accomplishers in the world. They want their names to be among those innovators and so forth. I think that's not obviously what God is pointing to, what Paul is pointing to in a place like this. Over in Luke chapter 10, and there in verse 38, it says, now, as they were traveling along, they entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed them into her home. She had a sister called Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations, and she came up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister's left me to do all the preparations alone? Tell her to help me. And you know what Jesus tells her. Her focus is in the wrong place. And I think, as we have that limited resource, people realize that something's got to give. And sometimes it can be that the thing that gives is our devotion and our time of dedication to God. And that can't be the thing that gives. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. There's also, I think, as we're talking about time management and productivity, the danger of pride that James talks about in James chapter 4 and verses 13 through 15 that we looked at as we're going through the book of James not too long ago. Here is the idea that I'm in complete control of how my time goes. It's one of the real dangers. I think it's very valuable to schedule out your day, to know what you're going to be doing. But one thing that you sort of need to have as a banner over that scheduling is the notion of James chapter 4 and verse 13 through 15. That is, if the Lord wills, this is what I plan. Because what happens is, guess what? Your day doesn't go as planned. And that's not only because, things in the world don't go like you hoped that they would, but life at home doesn't go like you wish it would. So especially, I think of like Amy and I talk about making a schedule, and I make a pretty tight schedule, and she makes a very hopeful schedule, right? That's what I hope to accomplish. She's got that banner a lot more solidly above that than I do, because she recognizes I'm going to get up, and if I don't have a child running in who's just been playing in the toilet, and then another one who just drew on a wall, and then I'm going to accomplish these things. And that's an idea we need to keep in our minds, is that while we need to take control of our time, it's limited how far we can take that control. I think a lot of what came out of Puritan time thought has led to some of those dangers. While there are certainly some advantages, there's also these dangers. Well, the next group that I want to look at use this phrase. This is the Quaker idea of looking at time. It's redeeming the time. And of course, that comes from Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 16, as we read earlier. There's a lot of overlap in redeeming the time and improving the time. But in this case, there's a lot more emphasis on spiritual usage of the time. They even, in order to, as they thought about time and about redeeming it, they even removed the names of the days of the week and the months because they're associated with paganism. I don't know if you know that, but our days of the week are named after pagan gods. Thursday is Thor's day. That's where that comes from. Now, I don't care about that. I don't think any of us are worshiping Thor on Thursday when we say that. But that's how far they went with this. The same thing with the months of the year, that they are named both after mythological gods and then also emperors of Rome. And so that they wanted to remove completely all those associations. So they would just say first day, second day, third day, first month, second month, third month. And they would use it that way. They additionally removed all the religious holidays from their calendar because they were not authorized by God. So they didn't have Christmas celebration. They didn't have Easter celebration. They said, look, every day is supposed to be enjoyed before God the same, and so we just strike those. Incidentally, the Puritans did the same thing. Historically speaking, Christmas is not a thoroughly American practice, especially in some of these northern regions. But they just removed all that and said, look, we're going to celebrate on times, occasions of celebration, but we don't want to make special days that God has not told us to make special. So they were very concerned about that. You can see in that. They condemned the idolatry, and here's where they begin to separate themselves from the improving time lot. They condemned the idolatry of time. And these were people who did not as much feel the pinch of getting it all done. They were more inclined about making sure you got the most important things done. Right? Make sure that these things done. Don't just try to pack it and cram it full. Make sure you leave time for what's most important. Well, certainly, as we think about redeeming the time, you can see that's what's going on in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 16. When Paul tells us to redeem the time, you have, in that very verse, you have him saying that because the days are evil. But even if you back up and you come at the context a few verses prior to that, it says, beginning in verse 11, do not participate in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead even expose them. For it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they are exposed by the light, for everything that becomes visible is light. For this reason it says, awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Therefore look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. I think as you tie this back to Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 2, Ephesians chapter 2, beginning of verse 1, he says, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the ruler of the power of the air, the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. We live in a world that is ruled by Satan. Now, I know I preached just last week about how this world is ruled by Christ, and I believe that too. I believe Christ is over even that. But at a local level, you might say, we live in a world that is ruled, that its ways, its behaviors are ruled by Satan. And so the idea here is that what you have to do with your time, if you want to use it well, you got to go take it from the one who seems to have ownership over it. And he seems to. Like, if you go through life on default mode, who's going to be in control of your time? This is what I ask people a lot of times when they're sort of just eat up with social media, their phone and so forth. Who decides how you use your time? It's not you. It's the people who make those apps, right? They're deciding how you use your time. They're figuring out ways to capture your time. And if you want to take it back, you're going to have to go grab hold of it and wrest it. That's how the Quakers thought about time. It just as a resource floating out there, Satan's got control of it. You want control of it, you better grab it back from him. That means you're going to have to be very thoughtful. It's not just be productive, but be spiritually minded about your time and make sure that you're pointing it. Watchful vigilance is the context there in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 16. Good things can even rob you of redeeming the time if they're not carefully thought about. That's the idea with Martha, right? She's doing good things, but she is not focusing on the best things. And so she is robbed even in trying to do valuable, profitable things. In 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 8, along those lines, 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 8, this is a favorite verse for a lot of people who don't want to go to the gym. For bodily training is only of little profit. There. It doesn't do much. Now, that doesn't say it's not valuable at all, but in seriousness, if you've got limited time and it comes down to I can either go to the gym or I can give more time and attention to God's word, or any time and attention to God's word, you stick your nose in here first. This is eternal value. That's temporal, limited value. And so there's nothing not only immoral, but there's even a lot of value in physical exercise, but it will not provide you the kind of value that spiritual exercise, which is what Paul is urging Timothy onto here. Well, that brings us to the backcountry people. Again, that would be people in the South, all across the South. Backcountry people talked about time like this. They're just passing the time. Now, that sounds at first like not very good. And certainly there's an element that seems less careful and urgent, and there is that. Some people, especially as people from the North would visit the South, they would write about the laziness that they saw across the South. Let me just tell you, people who farmed massive territories and lived off the land and so forth are not lazy people, but they were slower people. I don't mean mentally slower, but just slower in the way that they lived life. And really, this idea of passing the time, for the most part, came from kind of a Ecclesiastes chapter 3 thought process. There's a time for everything. And so where the Puritan mind wants to take control and not be led around by time, the idea in the South is, look, we've done the work that's supposed to be done today. Tomorrow will take care of itself. What are you so worked up about? And so it was a more laid back and even more sort of resigned way of submitting to the realities of time. I think what you find as you read some of the things that people said about time in this part of the world at that time, that it coincides with what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, part of his conclusions that he is drawing all along. One of the repeated refrains you find in Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and in verse 24, there's nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and have his soul see good in his labor. This also I have seen, that it is from the hand of God. You might come into the South and see a man and his wife sitting on their front porch, rocking in their rocking chairs and sipping on some tea. And the Puritan comes in and says, you're lazy. And they say, no, the day's work is done. Why would we keep going? And that's essentially what Solomon says. Look, go, the people who are going and going and going and trying to get everything that they can get, what's the result of all of that? So there's some real value in just saying, okay, you don't have to fill every single waking minute of the day with activity. There's enough for the day. And then it's appropriate to enjoy the labor that you've had in that day. It encouraged, I believe, contentment about what was outside of their control. There was a sense of, look, the Lord will do what the Lord will do. And we'll just see how that comes out. When you're farming, when you are a particularly agricultural society, let me tell you, especially before we get all of our modern irrigation and so forth, you learn real fast that there's not a lot you can do to make the weather do what you wish it would do. So people say, what are you going to do about this? I've done all that I can. I've plowed the field. I've planted the seed. What is there left to do? I got to wait. And we'll just see what God does. And so that's a good attitude. And that's what Matthew chapter 6 and verses 25 through 34 is telling us. What can you change? You can't change your height. You can't change your hair. Worry about today and not tomorrow. Now, is there a danger there? Well, certainly there's a couple of dangers. First of all, there is real laziness that can come from this. There's the person that can say, we're not going to worry about tomorrow when there actually is something you could be doing about what's due tomorrow, right? So this is not an encouragement. When somebody says tomorrow's troubles sufficient for the day are the troubles before us, that notion doesn't excuse you from actually taking action today that will help you tomorrow. What it means is once you've done everything today that can be done, that's it. You must wait. You can't just, have total control over what will be. You can't provide for all the possibilities. Somebody might say, a procrastinator might say, why do today what I can put off till tomorrow? That's not what Jesus is saying. And this kind of mindset could lead to an extreme in that direction. Another aspect, though, is that it can and did in many cases sort of lead to a fatalism. Like there's nothing you can do to change what's going to happen. These are the original "it is what it is" people. And what they mean by that is that, like, no matter what I do, what's going to happen is going to happen. Sort of I think a distorted view of God's sovereignty. I think they end up like those in Jeremiah chapter 18 and Jeremiah chapter 18 and verse 12. After Jeremiah has given this story of the potter and the potter's house and how things can change. If you change, God will change what he's doing. The potter will change. But he says in verse 12, they will say, it is hopeless, for we are going to follow our own plans, and each of us will act according to the stubbornness of his evil heart. Here are people saying, they're not just saying it is what it is from the standpoint of that's something I can't do anything about. They're saying even right here it's something I can't do anything about. We are who we are. We're going to be what we will be. That's not an appropriate way to, quote, put your trust in God. There is some sense of which we need to take the control that God has given us while understanding the limits of that control. Well, finally, we come to the Virginia people, the Cavaliers. They talked about time as killing time. Now, Kevin noted as he was looking through the PowerPoint, he says, I noticed you didn't put up any scriptures for killing time. And that's true. This is the worst of the ways that time was viewed among all these different groups. It's even worse than the person who thinks he's in total control of his time. When you had the people who talked about killing time were the people, it came from the top. You had rich sort of lords of the manor, of the territory. And while most people got to get up and go to work, we talked about that working from sun up to sundown, these people would sleep in. And somebody might say, you're killing time, you're burning daylight. And they're like, I know, because I can afford to. So the idea of killing time in their minds, it's sort of like a millionaire coming up to a starving man and throwing $100 bills into a furnace and just watching him, right? I can do this, you can't, right? And so he's got time to spare. He can afford to kill time. This came out in the way that they slept in and so forth, the way that they partied. They developed a lot of the games, sort of recreational activities that some of them that even persist till today come from this culture, that basically it's a leisure culture. I can afford to be leisurely. This person pursues waste with a vigor. Like they are trying to figure out the best ways to waste time. I think about that sometimes when I talk to maybe a young man who plays a lot of video games. And that young man might say, yeah, but listen, it's really, really fun. Well, I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying it's not valuable. Or at least minimally valuable. And the more you do of that, the more it certainly falls into killing time. It moves from recreation that is supposed to be limited and helpful so that you can get back to work over into laziness and abuse and waste of the precious resource that we have. Our society then, as I think about where we are, how we talk about and how we make usage of time, don't you think that we fall into the worst two extremes? Where we have on the one end the people who think that they are in complete control and that they can get all the things done and they can pack more in than actually there are hours in a day. Sleep, who needs sleep? I won't even budget for that. 4 hours, I'll be fine. And then on the other end, you have people trying to figure out with a head of steam what's the best ways to kill time. It's like the complete opposite of the lessons Solomon wanted us to learn in Ecclesiastes. You have some people on the end of, I am going to be the one who actually accomplishes so much that at the end of my life, I will have satisfaction. And on the other end, you've got the people saying, I'm the one who's pursuing pleasure with wisdom. And I'm going to figure out how to really be satisfied with the hedonist pleasures that this world has to offer. And Solomon has already told us, let me tell you, dead ends in both directions. I think that's one of the reasons people talk about the increase in anxiety and so forth. You look at Ecclesiastes, that's what Ecclesiastes is this guy saying, I went down that road, what did I find? Vanity, anxiousness, no purpose, no fulfillment. On both of these ends, that's what you have. You have the super productive guy who at the end of the day realizes that no matter how much he does, at some point he's got to set it all down and hand it over to people who are going to waste it all. And you got the person who never did a valuable thing in his life, but boy, he had a lot of fun. And at the end of the day, he realizes he's an old person. He can't even have that anymore. And it's useless and it's vain. And most of them, if there's any wisdom, will, like Solomon, look back and think, I wish I'd have just done a good day's work, raised a family, gone home and enjoyed my family. And I wish that those people wish that they had lived the kind of life with that limited time so that they could see the fruit of their life standing around them as they leave this life. See the people that were going with them into eternity, as opposed to the person who dies alone and who has no expectation that it's going to get any better after that. It is a sobering thing to think about time. In the first place, we need to be thoughtful about how we use this scarce resource. We do need to be productive. We do need to think of ourselves as stewards of this resource that God has given us. But it isn't enough to just a packet full go off into one extreme or the other. The person who says, I'm going to get all these things accomplished. The person who says, I'm going to spend my days just lazily enjoying life. Our goal is not just to use it all up in any old way. Our goal is to recognize its reality, recognize its end. Soon you'll be out of it. And then what? And act according to that thought process. I think the people who thought best about time thought eternally about time, about when there will be no more time. And what then? The only great fear about time should be that we should run out of it without having prepared for that moment. That's the biggest warning about time. And so if you're here this morning, I hope that some of these thoughts help you make better usage of time, but I hope most of all that you take the time you have right now to secure that moment, because it's the only one that matters when this life is over. That single moment when time vanishes for you. If there's anybody who needs to respond to that invitation, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?